Jacob had always been a lover of the great outdoors. He spent every summer exploring new trails and camping under the stars. This year, he decided to venture into the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, a place renowned for its untouched beauty and eerie solitude. On the third night of his trip, Jacob found a perfect spot to set up camp, a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. As dusk settled, he lit a fire and prepared his meal. The quiet of the forest was broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of leaves in the breeze. After dinner, he settled into his tent, enjoying the tranquility. Sometime around midnight, Jacob was jolted awake by a sound. It was faint at first, but soon it grew louder, an eerie rhythmic chanting that seemed to come from deep within the forest. He strained to hear, trying to convince himself it was just the wind. But the chanting grew clearer, more distinct, and undeniably human. Heart-pounding, Jacob grabbed his flashlight and cautiously unzipped his tent. The chanting seemed to be all around him now, echoing through the trees. He stepped outside, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The chanting abruptly stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence. Jacob scanned the forest, his breath visible in the cold night air. He saw nothing, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. He quickly retreated to his tent, trying to shake off the sense of dread. Just as he zipped the tent closed, he heard it again. This time, right outside his tent. A low, guttural voice whispered, "Leave." Jacob froze, his mind racing. He didn't wait to find out who or what was out there. He grabbed his essentials, stuffed them into his backpack, and bolted. He ran through the forest, not stopping until he reached his car, miles away from his campsite. He never returned to that forest, and to this day, he can't explain what he heard that night. Lena and her friends decided to take a weekend trip to a remote campsite in the Appalachian Mountains. The group of 6 was excited for a weekend of hiking, storytelling, and roasting marshmallows around the campfire. They found a secluded spot near a serene lake and set up camp. The first night went smoothly, filled with laughter and spooky stories. The second night, however, took a darker turn. As they were gathered around the campfire, Lena noticed a faint light flickering through the trees about 100 yards away. It looked like another campfire. Curious, the group decided to investigate. As they approached the light, they saw a small clearing with a smoldering campfire and what appeared to be abandoned camping gear. There were no signs of people, just an eerie stillness. They called out, but no one responded. Feeling uneasy, they returned to their campsite, but the mood had shifted. That night, Lena woke up to the sound of footsteps outside her tent. She peeked out, expecting to see one of her friends. Instead, she saw a shadowy figure standing by the campfire, staring into the flames. Panic set in as Lena realized the figure was not one of her friends. She zipped her tent closed and huddled in her sleeping bag, hoping it was just a trick of the light. The footsteps continued, circling the campsite, and then stopped. The next morning, Lena told her friends what she had seen. They were all on edge but decided to stay one more night. As darkness fell, the flickering light reappeared in the distance. This time, no one was brave enough to investigate. That night, the footsteps returned, louder and more insistent. They seemed to be coming from all directions, closing in on the campsite. The group stayed awake, huddled together, clutching whatever makeshift weapons they could find. At dawn, the footsteps ceased. Exhausted and terrified, they packed up and left as quickly as possible. Lena later learned that the area was rumored to be haunted by the spirits of settlers who had disappeared there centuries ago. She never went camping in the Appalachians again. Mark was an experienced hunter and camper, well-versed in survival skills. He often went on solo trips, enjoying the solitude of the wilderness. One autumn, he decided to hunt in a remote area of the Rocky Mountains, far from any marked trails. After a successful day of hunting, Mark set up camp near a stream. He cooked his dinner and settled in for the night. Around midnight, he was awakened by the sound of branches snapping nearby. Assuming it was an animal, he grabbed his rifle and flashlight, ready to scare it off. As he stepped out of his tent, he scanned the area but saw nothing. The forest was silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves. Mark shrugged it off and returned to his tent. Just as he was about to fall asleep, he heard it again, this time closer. Mark got up, determined to find the source of the noise. He moved cautiously, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. He saw nothing, but the feeling of being watched was palpable. Suddenly, his flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into complete darkness. He fumbled for his spare batteries, cursing under his breath. As he replaced the batteries, he heard a low growl behind him. Mark spun around, his flashlight now working but saw only trees. He felt a cold sweat trickle down his back. Deciding it was best to leave, Mark packed up his gear as quickly as possible. As he did, he heard the growl again, this time accompanied by heavy breathing. It was close, too close. Mark grabbed his rifle and started walking towards his truck, a mile away. The growling and breathing followed him, always just out of sight. He quickened his pace, the adrenaline pumping through his veins. When he finally reached his truck, he threw his gear inside and sped off, not daring to look back. Mark never returned to that area. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there had been stalking him, waiting for the right moment to strike. He still goes hunting, but he always makes sure he's not alone. Emily and her boyfriend, Tom, decided to go on a romantic camping trip in the dense forests of Maine. They found a beautiful spot by a river and set up their tent. As the sun set, they enjoyed a cozy campfire, sharing stories and toasting marshmallows. As the night wore on, they decided to explore the area a bit. They walked along the riverbank hand in hand when they stumbled upon an old, dilapidated cabin. The windows were broken and the door hung on its hinges. Curious, they decided to take a closer look. Inside, the cabin was musty and filled with old, broken furniture. It looked like it hadn't been inhabited for decades. They found old newspapers dating back to the 1950s and an ancient, rusted stove. As they were about to leave, Emily noticed something strange. A trapdoor in the floor, partially covered by a rug. Against her better judgment, Emily persuaded Tom to help her open the trapdoor. It creaked loudly as they lifted it, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading down into a basement. The air that wafted up was cold and damp. They descended the stairs, their flashlight beams illuminating the way. The basement was small and empty, except for a wooden chair in the center of the room. Strangely, the chair had heavy chains attached to its arms and legs, as if someone had been restrained there. A sense of dread washed over Emily. She felt as if they were intruding on something sinister. They quickly climbed back up the stairs and left the cabin, vowing to forget what they had seen. That night, Emily was restless. She kept hearing faint noises outside their tent, whispers, footsteps, and the sound of chains rattling. She tried to wake Tom, but he was sound asleep. She lay there, heart pounding, until the first light of dawn. In the morning, they packed up and left, not saying a word about the cabin. Later, Emily did some research and discovered that the cabin had once belonged to a notorious criminal who was known for kidnapping and torturing his victims. The chair in the basement was likely where he kept them. Emily and Tom never spoke of that night again, but the memory of the abandoned cabin and its chilling secret haunted them for years.